Hi, this is Mark Gowdy from Quest Software. Thanks for joining today. I'm very excited because today I'm joined by a good friend to talk about a subject that here at Quest Software we hear every day from our customers. We're also discussing internally this very important topic, and we figured we'd get together and have a chat and bring to you probably the first part of a conversation around this topic. That topic is observability. And that good friend is Alan Habib, the CEO and president of Systems Management Associates. SMA has been a long-term technology partner for Quest Software and couldn't be happier to spend some time with Alan. Alan, thanks for joining me.
Mark, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you as always. As you already know, SMA has been around the enterprise management and observability space for about 25 years, and there's several pillars that support our business. Among them are enterprise architecture consulting, implementation integration services, and development of application and database management solutions that extend industry-leading platforms, such as Quest's Foglight. So thanks for having me.
And as I mentioned earlier, one of the most talked about buzzwords in IT right now is observability. A word that's easier to say than spell for me anyway. I know I used to think about monitoring and observability. When I hear about observability, my first thought was, well, that's just monitoring on steroids. That's really just monitoring plus plus. But that's not true. And Alan and I have many years of experience in the monitoring technology space and figured it would be a good place to start. So, Alan, let's start there. Could you give us a quick rundown on the history of monitoring in IT and how you've seen that evolve over the past 25 years?
Many thanks, Mark. I'm happy to take a trip down monitoring memory lane. It always brings up some fond memories of customers and the evolutions of their monitoring systems. Even prior to starting SMA, I had worked at Sun Microsystems, and I was responsible for assisting with their enterprise management solutions and business partnerships. Sun, unlike their competitors in the space, IBM and Hewlett Packard, did not have native monitoring tools outside of base hardware monitoring. And so um, among my tasks were to go out and build business partnerships with companies that had tools for monitoring systems, operating systems, databases, and applications. And many of these companies were based in the Northeast, like Computer Associates and IBM, and we also and BGS Software, which later became part of BMC Software, which did system and workload monitoring. And so I'd gotten involved with it, and actually it was those relationships and my observation of a growing need in the space that led me to forming SMA. Um, Back 30 years ago, if you walked into a data center, um, the key applications were mainly mainframe based, or they might have been based on large mini computers like DEC VAXes or um, Sperry or Burroughs systems. And that started to evolve uh, when Unix and Linux systems became more part of data centers. And unlike mainframes, which were very large and expensive to maintain, they were smaller, slightly less expensive, but they were growing quickly in numbers. So organizations quickly looked at their vast set of tools for monitoring mainframes and said, well, we need something like this on distributed systems. And that was really where the demand came into place, and companies like BMC and Quest started to develop solutions to help them out. I would say over the years, um, tools developed to monitor systems, monitor applications, and detect problems. And I think most of the customers that we went to and had implemented systems, their next question was, okay, so I know there's a problem now. What do I do next?
Yeah.
And and I think that of all the companies that we worked with, it was Quest who really came, with an answer. Is okay. Well, we can help you diagnose and even resolve some of these issues. And I think that that question and what to do next, it's still very poignant, and 25 years later, and it's still something that customers want to do, and it's still something that organizations are helping. They're building solutions to help customers do that.
And we've seen, as you said, monitoring progress over those 25 years from people writing scripts to manage their systems, to get insight into what's happening. Typically set a threshold. I know something went wrong before. It looked like this. Let's set a script to check for that. And tools then started to replace those over the years. But what do you see the current limitation in that approach, that monitoring based approach, typically looking at metrics and log files? What are some of the challenges that we still face now?
Well, so let me take a half a step back there. A point I wanted to make. When we were selling to organizations 30 years ago or 25 years ago, I think the question from customers was, well, why do I need a monitoring tool, right? I've got these brilliant top tier DBAs and application specialists, and they write scripts, and I'm getting all the data that I need. And I said, you know, so I thought about, well, it's a good question. Why do you need it if you're getting the information that you need? And really, some of the benefits of implementing a monitoring solution were, first of all, you have a centralized repository for scripts or for data collection for the actual data. And then if those if those DBAs got a better offer somewhere else, you didn't lose, all the information and all the knowledge that your organization had built. Um, so you were protecting, IT information, IT assets. It became a central repository and also a repository for what to do next. Because if you had a script and a threshold was breached and you generated an alert, you could often have notes in that alert to say, okay, well, look here or do this. So again, you could improve the knowledge base of the organization and reduce, mean time to recovery. What was the second part of your question?
Yeah, second part is around some of those challenges of current monitoring tools
Yeah,
and approaches.
yeah. So I think some of the challenges is that now we have so many viable tools in the marketplace. I think that companies try to choose a tool, and they should choose a tool that's the best fit for their team, something that maybe their team understands or can easily understand, maybe something they used before, and something that gives them the highest percentage of what they're looking for. In other words, checks as many boxes as to what's important for them, and it's also customizable or able to be tailored to their organization needs. So the challenges is selecting the right set of tools. There's no one tool that's going to do everything you need to across the enterprise. So, and you don't want to have hundreds or thousands of tools. You don't want one tool to manage, DP2 and another tool to manage Oracle and another tool to, manage TIBCO. You want as few tools as possible, common interface, common repositories that are feeding up, to an observability or an enterprise management tool, right?
Yeah.
Um, so the challenges there's so much data that's available. There's so many tools on the marketplace. How do I choose the right tools with the right set of data that gets me to, a manageable enterprise?
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a challenge, as we've seen, is getting the right tool. Do you go generalized or specialized? How do you then have a view of how all of these components start to play into each other? And
Mm-hmm.
monitoring, historically, monitoring has always been about looking at metrics, looking at logs, setting thresholds for availability, performance, scalability, and then alerting on those when things go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so you lose the ability to see how these systems interconnected. You lose the ability to understand the impact on the wider system. You
Mm-hmm.
lose that context.
You do, and the way that I have described this to customers, and I have a very complex or overly complex architecture diagram of of an enterprise that shows these are mid-tier managers that often that you're talking about. We're talking about database performance management or application performance management or security management or the management of job scheduling or network management. So all of those mid-tier managers provide information within their stack, if you will, right? And so how do you take all of that information and combine it together to understand what's important to the enterprise, what's important to the different services that the enterprise is supporting, and what's important to the businesses, right? And um, that's where the hard work comes in, and
Yeah.
whether you start at the data level and have the data that's collected share information on what system or business process it's a part of, or whether you build that at a higher level, it's important to get there, right? And that gives you a context for how a particular metric or database, right, is affecting the availability of your business. And do you have to get up in the middle of the night, or can this wait till the morning, right? So I think
Agreed.
those challenges exist today. There, the good news is that there's more tools than ever today. There's more ways to collect data. There's standardized agents like Prometheus. There's open telemetry data that can feed into these models. There are specialized tools like Foglight, New Relic, and App Dynamics that we mentioned before, Datadog, some of these in the industry. And so all of these can feed data into the model, but the challenge still exists. What do you do once you have data in the model? And in terms of what tools to select, I think organizations still want to give their infantry people the best tools possible. And why wouldn't you, right? You want to give them a tool that's going to help them resolve the problem. So a big general tool that collects a lot of data that might be valuable for the enterprise, but it's not going to be valuable for a DBA or an application specialist trying to understand, what service is affected and what Java application is running out of memory.
Yeah, you still have to restore systems when things go wrong. You
Correct.
still have people who are managing those particular components or multiple components of the system, and they still have to answer the question, well, what happened and why? And how do I fix it as quickly as possible? How do I restore service as effectively and efficiently as possible and expand that time between those failures?
Yeah, and 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 that is true. And there are some architectures, some solutions that are kind of changing that to some extent because databases like Snowflake, for example, where um, resources can expand dynamically, right? You're less likely to run into kind of traditional performance things. However, you might start running into some real cost issues if
Hmm.
those are expanding or you're not shutting down or turning off resources that you don't need. So there's perhaps another element of enterprise management that is that's coming into play now, which is cost management, right? So in addition to you know monitoring and managing the applications, you also need to look out for growing costs, and that's true whether you employ a solution like Splunk for monitoring logs and they charge based on consumption, or Snowflake that charges based on consumption. So you need to not only know the performance and query performance, things like that, but you also need to know the impact on costs of running your data center.
For sure. And bringing it back to something you mentioned earlier around architectures, I think this is something we're seeing here at Quest and something I've been having conversations with many customers is modern applications are increasingly becoming more complex.
Yes.
You're moving away from this single monolithic architecture that would be a mainframe or a WebLogic server with one or two databases in the back end for data stores. You're moving into this cloud-based model. You're moving into hybrid architectures. You're adding containers. You're adding microservices. You're adding things like serverless computing.
Yeah.
And you need holistic visibility across all of those stacks, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Everyone's been looking individually at their stacks, but you need holistic visibility across all of those stacks.
Yeah.
And as you move further away from those monolithic architectures, you get higher levels of flexibility, you get higher levels of scalability, you get higher levels of velocity for the business, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But it becomes harder to see all of those parts, how they're connected, and where and why things might be breaking.
And,
That becomes super complicated, and highlights one of the major. That highlights one of the major issues around monitoring tools and platforms and approaches, and where observability platforms are now starting to add value.
yes, I can't tell you how many organizations that have come to me or to us over the years and said, well, how do I build a good management infrastructure, right? And my initial response to them is always, that's you start by building a manageable infrastructure. Now that's easier than it sounds, right? And what I meant by that was you select some standards for your organization, right? You don't want to choose one item off of every shelf in the supermarket, because then you have an unmanageable, infrastructure. So to the extent you can, you have some corporate standards, and you try to minimize the numbers of applications, databases, storage devices, hardware devices that you're managing. Now, that becomes more challenging when you start looking at large organizations that are growing both organically and through acquisition. We have customers that we share jointly that have grown by acquiring dozens of organizations globally, and each one of those organizations has a unique architecture. They have their own standards, and so now all of a sudden you're merging all of these different standards, and
Yeah,
observability platforms become more important, more relevant, and making sense of the data becomes more difficult, but more important.
agreed. There's, as a side note, there's a great author, a guy called Charles Perrow. He's a sociologist, and he talks about complex systems from that sociology perspective. He talks about accidents, in real world. He talks about normal accidents, he calls them, and saying that they're unavoidable, and we cannot design around accidents in today's complex and highly coupled systems. And that's true in IT.
Yeah.
Something is going to happen, and how do you instrument those systems to better recover when things do go wrong? Plan for it. It's hard to plan around it, so now you have to design systems that allow you to recover faster and give insight to the right people.
Yeah, it's the same thing with raising children. Something will happen. You will have to recover from it. So,
Uh,
any parent certainly understands. And
for
yes,
sure. So, Alan, we should probably take a step back, and we've mentioned observability several times, but we might do well defining what it means. If I think about classical control theory, observability is a measure of how well the internal states of a system can be inferred from external outputs.
mhm.
What does that really mean? What does it mean, especially in this context around IT systems?
Well, I think it really means, how healthy is your overall enterprise, right? And I think that observability looks at the enterprise from the top down, but it's really built from the bottom up. And the components, as defined by some of the industry leaders in the space, like Grafana today, um, include metrics components, logs components, and traces components, right? And metrics can come from a variety of places. Traditionally, they come from solutions like Quest Foglight, or like BMC Patrol, or HP Operations, or IBM Tivoli. all of these systems utilize agents or agentless technologies. Not that there really is such a thing. This is really where a collector resides, right? But they're they're using some form of scripts or database access or APIs to collect what is often a common set of data from an application or a database or a system. Um, so those metrics, come into play. They're part of the observability model. Logs are another component of observability models. Logs are often more granular. Uh, Database replication solutions and backup solutions use things like uh, Oracle's redo logs, right, to get to a particular point in time, to see, if a backup failed, what is the restore point? Where did the data break occur, and then start to restore from there. So logs are a very granular um, data source for enterprise management, for observability, but there is a lot of data there. There is terabytes or petabytes of data to an organization. Um, Traces are also very valuable. So traces can provide information on, what happened in an application stack, right? If there was a request made, through a web server, through a middleware process back to a database, well, how long did that take? How much of that time was spent, um, you know, at at the web layer, at the application layer, in the middleware layer, in the database layer, in the network layer, and where did the delay occur? So a lot of information in there as well. But again, the key is there's a lot of information. So um, the challenge with observability these days is not collecting the data, even though there's some work involved to do that. It's with selecting the data sources that make sense for your organization. Some are going to be in place, some will need to be extended, and um, and then how to take all of that data, store it for a relevant period of time for your organization, analyze it, and then make something visible, uh, actionable on that, so that you can maintain a good picture of health across the enterprise, and resolve complex computing problems.
Yeah, for sure. And I think traces is really the main differentiator. If you think about traditional monitoring approaches and you think about observability as a practice and observability platforms, is really adding traces to the mix. And what that really means is just having context, of the entire path of whether that's a database call or an application call, and looking at the entire event by time, being able to see what that flow looked like.
You
Having those in conjunction with the metrics and in conjunction with logs allows you to ask any question, allows you to understand what was happening in your system at a particular period of time, and ask any question, including those that you might not have thought about. That's something with monitoring approaches and monitoring tools, you are expected to bring the expertise to the tool.
know,
You're expected to be able to make those intuitive leaps. Often that's what happens when you're using monitoring platforms. You're applying your own knowledge of that technology area to say, oh, I know I've got this buffer pool cache ratio thing going off. That's because of this.
yeah.
But having a wider context and wider view really gives you the ability to say, oh, what questions aren't I thinking about before you're asking it? It's almost, for our friends in the US, it's almost the unknown unknowns. And lets you get insight into what those unknown unknowns might be.
And I think the traces are where a lot of the meat is here, whether it's an application trace or a database trace or a query trace, right? The ability to collect and make sense of that data. There's an expectation by customers who are spending good money on tools, that the tools will bring them a lot of information on these traces and allow them to analyze that data in a dimensional manner, right? So that you be able to look at that data in multiple dimensions so that it makes sense for them in a particular scenario. Uh,
Yeah, I like this idea of leaning into the dimensional observability. So let me, take a step back. Alan, that's great. We could almost call this dimensional observability. I like this. We're defining new terms on this call. We're coming up with a new IT landscape for tooling. Dig into this more. I really like the idea of being able to sort of take a look at a system from multiple perspectives,
and I,
especially when thinking about tools that have traditionally lined up as a monitoring single approach into a platform. Where does dimensional observability give you a benefit?
well, I think that anybody who's ever been on a sales call or a technical call with an engineering team understands that customers are unique. Their requirements are unique, right? Their systems are unique. And so one customer may say, well, look, I need to know everything that's going on from the perspective of this user, right? And because this user is troublesome, or this application that leverages this user is troublesome. So I need to see this data and the impact on resources from the perspective of this user. Another scenario might be that, well, I need to see, we have this particular query that we know is troublesome, or gets away from us at a certain time of the day. So I need to see from the perspective of this query what system or database resources are being used. So again, I think this dimensional observability becomes a very important component in diagnosing, right, and understanding issues, and in shortening the mean time to recovery. And what I've learned is there are never enough dimensions. Maybe in the twilight zone, but not in monitoring. You're always going to find a customer or a scenario where they say, well, I know what you've given me 8 different ways to analyze this data, but I really need 9 and 10. And in general, we appreciate that input, because that's where we grow from, right? That's where we say, okay, I hadn't thought of that, or I hadn't thought that somebody might need it. But again, I think that's where the opportunity to grow is, and that's where the ultimate value and the meat of these solutions is.
Yeah, I agree. Being able to ask any question of your system, understand any user's behavior or subjective experience without having to think about the question in advance is key.
Very valuable.
Yeah, this is great. Last question. And I think will definitely have a part two. But
Mhm.
last question for now. When someone's in the market for an observability platform, what are some of the checklists they should have when thinking about a tool that they might need?
So, an observability tool is, very much what we historically called an enterprise manager, right? And so, enterprise, they're manager of managers, right? So it's the ability to take as have as many integrations with their current tool set as possible. So they're going to look across the enterprise and they're going to say, we have 30 tools. Maybe we want to get that down to 20. Here are here are the 20 core tools that we need to manage the enterprise. What integrations exist, with the observability tool, right? How much, what do we need to build? Ultimately, there's going to be a services component to whatever it is that a company's trying to implement or extend their implementation of. So what do we have natively? What do we need to extend? And then how does it help us make sense of the data and drill down into the data? So you might have um, a complex rule that says, well, gee, if this section of the network is slow and and all the applications and databases are under this are slow, well, it's probably not the applications and databases, right? It might be a network segment or resources, something like that. So it's something that helps you make sense of all the different data that's coming in, and natively connects to what you have there now.
Okay.
there's more to it than that, and so there's plenty of more there's plenty more meat for our next section.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in our next section, we'll talk about some of those particular, talk about things like open telemetry, why it's gaining traction, why it's the second
Sure.
most popular product and platform on the CNCF. We'll talk about Grafana. We'll talk about individual tools. We'll talk about getting into database specifically.
Hmm.
I do have a question. I know I said it was my last question, but I feel like Colombo. I got one more for you. Uh, what do
Sure.
you what do
Anything
you
for an old
think?
friend.
What do you think the impact on observability will be from AI? Everyone's talking about AI right now. What do you think its impact will be on observability?
Oh, I think it'll have a significant impact on observability. I think that initially it'll assist in implementing and administering tools, right? So, how do I deploy this agent, or how do I configure this agent for a particular, to monitor a particular application or database? So you'll be able to get configuration information. Some vendors are already doing that. I think you'll be able to ask systems, okay, well, this application is, ultimately you want to be able to ask, well, this application is slow. Tell me why it's slow. And AI will understand the different components of that application and say, well, it's most likely not the database because it never is, right? So, but it's most likely this tier or this component, or I noticed that you've got one of your data centers, the air conditioning unit failed, and so that's down. So I think it'll have a very significant impact, and we're all looking at it very closely now to understand how to use it in the short term and what impacts it'll have on us long term. But it'll be positive and life altering.
Agreed. And it's funny, 25 years into this, that you mentioned something that I just wanted to tag on here. I still get people asking me, help me prove it's not my part of the business, and help me prove it much more quickly than before. Large enterprises, that is what they're looking for, is I need to make sure things don't break. If they do, I need to restore. And I also, equally as important, need to prove that it's not me.
Well, I think we're starting to get into philosophy of human nature. Um, but
That's for part two or part three on the conversation.
yes,
Uh,
or part 11. But I look forward to that conversation, and I think certainly part of any diagnostics is understanding what it isn't. Sometimes in complex systems, that's a good place to start.
yeah, agreed. Alan, thank you. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you. I appreciate your insights, appreciate your experience, and also appreciate your partnership over the years. Thanks for your time. We'll speak soon.
My pleasure. Look forward to it. Bye bye now.